And in fact, you show in the book, of course, that there are multiple figures throughout these first three phases, or the first three phases of the MCU. People like T'Chaka and Odin, these father figures who kind of must be sacrificed in order for their sons to learn the value of peace, which I find fascinating. My question is this a theme that we find in mythology? And if so, let me kind of piggyback with that. Why do you think the MCU chose to really push this theme forward? Welcome to the Neutral Ground. If you're familiar with my show, you know that I love talking about heroes and the heroic narrative, and that I'm even trying to get an article published on how Captain America from the MCU was able to elicit awe in people all over the world simply by lifting a hammer. So you can understand why I've been looking forward to this conversation since I saw the title of Dr. Michael Nichols' book, Religion and Myth in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And let me tell you, it does not disappoint. I'll have more to say about that actually in my closing remarks, but let me properly introduce our guest. Dr. Nichols has a PhD in religious studies from Northwestern University and is an assistant teaching professor in the Cornerstone Liberal Arts program at Purdue University. He has always been fascinated by the ways stories develop over time, how ancient themes carry over into modern media, and how connections within and between stories across culture help to reveal our common humanity. If you enjoy the conversation at any point, let me know by hitting the subscribe/follow button. We're building a special community here of people who want civilized discourse and big ideas to chew on, and we would love to have you with us. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Michael Nichols. Michael, welcome to the Neutral Ground. We're going to be discussing your fantastic book, Religion and Myth in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, as my audience will already know, I'm going to have to try really hard here to control my excitement. They know that this book and conversation is right up my alley, but we have to make sure that we can bring everyone along for the ride. So let me slow down, at least enough to establish some much needed groundwork before we go full force into some of the more weightier topics. Your book resides in the space where religious studies, mythology, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, henceforth MCU, meet. However, you go out of your way at the beginning of the book to emphasize that religious studies is not theology. Why is this an important distinction to make in your book? And can you talk a little bit about how this distinction shapes your approach to your study?
Well, thank you so much for that question. And also thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is a really great opportunity for me. And I love talking about this, as you can imagine. So I really appreciate this chance. And so that's a great starting point. And I suppose there are a couple of reasons for that distinction. One is that within the field of religious studies, that has been an ongoing concern, is being able to delineate the space where religious studies is and theology also resides, not in a pejorative way, but just that these are different fields that sometimes go about their projects in a different way. And so while I do look at how the MCU is able to provide meaning, I don't necessarily look at it as a religion in and of itself, which a theological approach might do. I do more of the comparative approach, which is looking at the ways in which there are elements within the MCU that might resemble what we find in other religious traditions, just like you would say, compare elements of Hindu traditions with Islamic or Buddhist traditions. I look at the MCU as its own sort of narrative body and how the themes that arise within it might also be found in other traditions, and the ways in which we can ask then questions about what it means to be human as a result. And so a theological approach might instead look at how we can find our own religious meaning in a particular work as more of the insider-outsider sort of distinction, that the religious studies approach has tended to be more of the outsider's look. And there are, of course, questions you can ask about how objective any person can be, but at least to an extent, more of an objective outlook. So I thought it was important maybe to set those clarifications in the beginning of the book before I launched into some of those comparative thematic elements that I saw within the MCU in some of the stories and some of the traditions that I brought out.
Yeah, and something else I think that we want to kind of define for the purpose of this conversation is also myth itself. How do you define myth within the context of this work?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Since the term is something that's I go back to again and again, it felt important to talk a little bit about the history of that term and the way in which I finally settled on at least a workable definition for the book, even though there are many different competing definitions for the term, is as a narrative that is at times perceived as timeless, but that notion of perception of timelessness is itself doing its own work. But that is a story that connects itself to aspects of the human condition that are really cross-cultural things like family, the, the difficulties of facing our own mortality, social structure, how we deal with forces that are beyond our own understanding. In this case, this would be superpowered entities and beings that resemble more of a monstrous take. You find those in a lot of these stories from around the world. We find it within the MCU as well. So that was one reason why I thought the term itself was very, very useful in this particular work. And I spent a little bit of time arguing the extent to which we can apply that term to the MCU. I think that you can, because it does a lot of the same work that myths do around the world and have done throughout history. And I think that in the reception that you get from audiences, it has this kind of timeless appeal. And so part of the argument of the book is to say we can use that term, and maybe using that term helps us to understand why it has been so incredibly popular, because it hits, yes, at a storytelling register, it's just fun to watch these stories, but there's also a deeper undercurrent that you find, and that might help to explain some of the popularity.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement. I think we'll kind of move through this theme throughout this discussion, but we might as well hit upon it here. I think we both agree that even though it seems like the MCU in 2008 just kind of came out of nowhere in terms of its popularity, it didn't really. I think it spoke to a yearning that we have today for these kind of stabilized narratives. And maybe let me move this through a question. In fact, let's address the postmodern elephant in the room. Although, if there were such a postmodern elephant, it would probably resist that label, as most postmodernists do. But it's been my contention on this show that our current neomodern appetites are really yearning for stabilized narratives. I think you accurately and fairly in your book, you do a great job of laying out legitimate concerns, however, that are brought forward by postmodernism, especially through grand narratives that attempt to define a people one particular way. As a species, we absolutely can be mobilized by perverse yearnings for power and hierarchies that divide. And arguably, I think the greatest way to do that is through narrative. But you have an important question, and you kind of hinted at this in your previous answer. The question that you ask in your book is, while still being attentive to distinctions and diversity, why not affirm the correspondences and resonances we find for what they reveal about each tradition in question, as well as our common humanity? Can we consume myth in such a fashion as you lay out, preserving distinctions while noting the commonalities? And if we do, what are some of the aspects of myth that we will find that we have in common as a species?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one of the concerns within religious studies, within the academy, is how do we maintain that balance between what we can perceive as commonalities, but also not erase the distinctions and smooth over the diversity and the variety that exists, and also pay attention to the ways in which myth has been used in pernicious ways. And I think that's, I do try to maintain that balance in the book, not say that all stories are the same, not say that myth is something that is totally and for all times a benign force because it's a tool like anything else that can be put towards very, very harmful ends. And we've seen that throughout history. One of the things that I do try to do is look at the ways in which different stories do have different layers and they do represent different cultural points of view. And what we get from the MCU is one particular cultural point of view. When you move a story into a popular culture environment, the medium is going to have its own influence and its own impact. And so one of the things I think you can find that are points of comparison, and comparison implies contrast at the same time. And so that's when you say comparative mythology, then in some ways has gotten to be, I think, perhaps wrongly understood as looking at things as just one more example and smoothing over all of the layers of difference that one you can also find. Comparison also implies contrast. And so I do look at differences as well within the book. But I think some of the things that you can find as commonalities is that across cultures and across time, there are different things that most human beings will have to face. We all grow up. We all go through different stages within our lives. Sometimes anthropologists give those rites of initiation as we move from one sphere of life to the next. There are family units and family structures which look different from place to place, but we still have to deal with our relationships with other human beings. We still have to deal with social structures. Those social structures may be different from time to place and have different emphases. We all have to face our own mortality. So there are things that are just inescapably part of the human experience, part of the human condition. And so when you look at the different stories and how they fit together, you can find the ways in which there are overlaps, like a Venn diagram, but that there are still those differences. And within the places where you have the touch points, I think we can have fruitful conversations about what each story contributes to, maybe a larger question about what is it that unites us as human beings on this planet.
Yeah. And I agree too. I think you make an important point, distinction here. Sometimes people do, like, for example, they'll look at flooding in Gilgamesh, and then they'll look at flooding in Job, and they'll just sort of look at those things almost as if they factor each other out, rather than actually take a look at it and see, okay, so what is a commonality here in terms of the human element? How are we looking at these destructive forces? What do they mean exactly? I think people I said Job. Why would I do that? What I mean is, of course, Noah. But we tend to overlook those and factor them out in a way that I think loses our ability to use myth as a really necessary tool for us to learn what it means to be human, and also to learn that we have been struggling with these similar problems for thousands of years, and that there's tremendous value. It's something that I try to instill in my students, is telling them, try to look at the history of problems here a little bit through narrative, and try to take some solace in the fact that you are a part of something that has been struggling with these issues for thousands of years, and draw strength from that. And myth, I think, does that absolutely beautifully.
Yeah, I agree. And with the example that you gave, yes, it's two flood stories and two stories of human catastrophe. But when you look at them closely, the value structures are very different. What you have, in the one story is one relationship to superpowered beings, to divine entities, and the other very different relationship. So you can bring out to it how each culture is putting forward their own values through a story that on the surface you could say, oh, just another flood story. But it actually tells us a lot about each of the different perspectives of each of those different authors. And one element that I think you see comes across within the MCU, which is maybe an additional episode in the human journey towards understanding ourselves, is dealing with technology. Within my classes, one of the books that we read actually is Gilgamesh. And students, unprompted by me, sometimes make the comparison between Gilgamesh and Tony Stark, where you have two very arrogant, very narcissistic individuals who go through this process of kind of coming to a better, slightly more virtuous version of themselves by the time the stories have ended. With Gilgamesh, it's political power and his own physical strength. And with Stark, it's technology and it's his ability to push the boundaries of human invention and innovation. And so, yes, the two stories have an overlap, but there's differences there. There's technology within Iron Man stories that would not fit into the context of Gilgamesh, but it shows us both a continuity and a difference, that humans are still working out boundaries. We're still working out what is the line between invention and transgression. And so the Iron Man story exists in that lineage, but it's both similar and different. And the conversation was very fruitful for thinking about where humans have come from and maybe where they're heading.
So, speaking of which, let's start making our way kind of toward the MCU here a little bit and integrating it even more into our discussion. You make an interesting distinction in the book, one that is, I think, not very common. We often hear arguments about how the superheroes of today are like the gods of old. But you actually take this discussion into a different place. You write, although I will often compare the MCU superheroes to gods, godlike figures, and epic heroes, the superheroes of the MCU are more like religious virtuosos, specialists of the sacred, people touched by divine powers who now mediate with the divine. Can you elaborate a little bit on this distinction a bit more for us and why it's important?
Yeah, it's something that I think a person could, when they look at the stories, when they think about the ways in which these characters act, one could, of course, push back against that definition. But the reason why I thought that was an interesting way, at least to think about these characters, is that in the way that the stories play out, their human position, their humanity, even in the case of a figure like Thor, who is coming from and inspired by deities from another culture, their humanity is very much emphasized. And within that particular opening chapter of the book, I look at the ways in which each of these characters kind of comes into their situation of having these special abilities or powers. And it's rather than being figures who are just born that way, who are coming into being as special and as having these abilities, they have to learn what to do with them, because in some ways they are either discovered or thrust upon them. And so this, at least in my understanding, was more aptly compared to people who gain abilities within a particular society and then play that role within that society. And as the MCU plays out, you find that that's how they're somewhat looked to by the rest of the world, at least in the glimpses that the movies give us. And there are benefits to that. There are also problems to that. There are also ways in which that creates issues in the ways that undercuts order and creates chaos at the same time, which is the same way that you find such figures in different cultures play. They're beneficial in some instances. They're also dangerous in others. One of the things that I think that some of the older scholarship in religious studies did well was talk about how what each culture considers the sacred has both its benign but also its more dangerous aspects to it. It's like a form of energy, like electricity. I sometimes have, in the past, when I was teaching courses where this would come up, be able to compare the sacred to electricity, that it's able to perform wonderful things. It's also dangerous. You have to be very careful around it. And that's also the way in which these superhero, the Avengers and other characters within the MCU kind of exists. They defeat villains. They also level cities at the same time. So that notion, I thought, was a helpful way for thinking about it. And also because in most of those phase one movies, or the movies which introduce these characters, the origin stories very closely parallel the stages of rites of initiation, with a separation moment, a liminal period. By liminal, I mean the in-between spots where there is especially chaotic, dangerous elements, and then coming out on the other end, a reintegration where the person has come to some terms and understanding with their new position and is able to exist in a different form, albeit changed. And so I thought that was at least a good way to think about it. By no means is that something I would consider to be the definitive, the final word on the way to understand these characters, but I thought it might be an interesting way to progress with an interpretation of these films and the roles that they play and connect it to other stories and other characters.
Yeah, and you mentioned the rites of passage of those first initial characters. That's something I want to dive deeper on a little bit later on as well. But something that what I thought of immediately when I read that part of your book is I thought of how much I love having the conversation with my students whenever I teach something like Gilgamesh or the Iliad. I love how disappointed they are at how unepic epic battle actually is. So here is Enkidu, and here's Gilgamesh, and they're going to have a battle. And what happens? Gilgamesh just tosses him. That's it. In the Iliad, Achilles versus Hector, it's not much of a battle. And we talk about, so why is that? Why can't you have, like we would have in movies today, these amazingly long battle scenes? We talk about why can't you have that here? And eventually they get to the idea of, well, you can't make someone else as close in power as the epic hero. And when I read this part in your book, I thought about the scene in Endgame when Captain America is standing alone up against Thanos. Everybody else is kind of defeated. Thor's defeated, Iron Man, all this stuff. And if they're too closely aligned, you lose just how much of a moment it is when Captain America is just standing there representing us in that moment, humans, and Thanos representing almost a kind of godlike figure. And it just brought it all into perspective for me. I probably would have originally been on the side of, well, they seem like almost like polytheistic gods. But actually, you've made me really rethink that with what you wrote in the book, with this idea of, no, it's better to keep more of a distance there, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think that the way that you phrase it, the way that you've talked about it, is that that makes the relatability for the audience so much easier as well. And that might be a way to identify, because and this has been the criticism at sometimes for other comic book figures, other superhero figures like Superman. They're just too powerful, too godlike, and that makes them too remote, too alien. And so if you have figures who are wounded in that scene that you're talking about, Captain America is bloodied, his shield is broken, and we can all identify with feeling like that at different points in times, facing what appear to be insurmountable challenges. And so that connects in a way, I think, much more than if you had figures who were untouchable, always able to pick themselves up, never seemed to lose a battle. And that's not what you find within these films. And that has been something that over its history, going back to the comics, has kind of separated Marvel from DC, is the more emphasis on the human-like element. Spider-Man is a person who, yes, he goes out and fights crime, but he also has real problems, like being able to pay his rent and being able to take care of his aunt. And those sorts of things make you feel more at home with these figures than maybe another character who is always able to bust through walls and solve the problems in moments. And that might be a distinction between a figure like a Gilgamesh or an Achilles, or a Beowulf, and some of the Marvel heroes, is that Marvel heroes' emphasis on their humanity really comes out in a lot of different moments, a lot of different instances.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. You reminded me too of an argument that me and my wife have in the house all the time. She's of that mindset of Superman is too powerful. She doesn't like it. She thinks this he's too powerful. Nothing can really kill him. And I, excuse me, I always have to talk about, well, he does have his own problems, and they're very human problems, really. But that's for a different discussion. It just you reminded me of that. At one point in the book, you talk about how the original MCU characters, and this is where we can really get into some depth about the rites of passages. You talk about the narratives of these original MCU heroes, Tony Stark, Thor, Captain America, and they're going through rites of passage, and you do so through the lens of Joseph Campbell and Arnold Van Gennep. When you discuss Tony Stark's journey specifically, you add, I think, an important character into the mix that I always thought never really gets enough appreciation, and that's Yinsen. And Yinsen, for those who may not remember, he's the gentleman who really helps Stark kind of build the Iron Man suit, the original one in the cave. But he also provides this mentorship for Stark as well. And in fact, you show in the book, of course, that there are multiple figures throughout these first three phases, or the first three phases of the MCU. People like T'Chaka and Odin, these father figures who kind of must be sacrificed in order for their sons to learn the value of peace, which I find fascinating. My question is this a theme that we find in mythology? And if so, let me kind of piggyback with that. Why do you think the MCU chose to really push this theme forward?
Well, it's a good question, and I think there are probably a couple of different explanations. Is that throughout mythological narratives, you find mentor figures of different forms, different stripes throughout. And one of the tragic things that frequently happens is having to lose those mentor figures throughout, say, the Mahabharata is a great example. That's the five Pandavas during the Civil War have to fight against a number of their mentors who have been guiding them throughout their lives. Within the Odyssey, Odysseus has Athena who is watching over him. When he gets home, he's able to meet his own father again. So there are always different mentor figures within the Divine Comedy. Virgil is leading Dante through the different levels of the afterlife. And so that is a common theme you find throughout world literature and world mythology. And there's a certain point past which the mentor figure cannot go, is that the person has to go on. That's, Virgil can't take Dante all the way. He has to leave him after purgatory. And so there's always this separation that occurs. And I think it mimics, in life as we're younger, we have our older figures that we find who guide us through, and due to just the basics of life, we will outlive them in many different cases. And so I think that's just a thing that's experienced on a human level throughout the world. And one way in which you could interpret the MCU is that it's simply reflecting that aspect of human experience. That's something that you find throughout a lot of world narratives. Joseph Campbell's one individual who has remarked on it. There are aspects of his work that are useful. I bring in those things which I think are really good. He has been criticized a great deal. I think in some cases those criticisms are quite warranted. And so I'm somewhat selective in the ways in which I use his book. But I think that his way of talking about the elements of myth that can touch us, I've always appreciated a great deal. And so I try to bring those parts in. But this journey that heroes go on, to borrow his phrase, is something you can find a lot of different elements. The more cynical interpretation that I've heard is that this concept of the hero's journey is something that has become more of a trope among screenwriters, and so that it's just kind of a formulaic thing that's brought in. So if you want to look at it as optimistic or pessimistic way of looking at storytelling, I think you have your choice. I think that it's probably a mix. There's a reason for certain formulas, and there's a reason why certain stories get retold. Maybe it's because you borrow from earlier tropes that you find in cinema. But on the other hand, the reason for the formula might be because it works, and because it does reflect things that are much older, like some of those mythological examples that I gave. So it's probably a mix of these things. And so you can kind of, in a cynical way, be repeating a pattern, but there is a reason to begin with for the pattern, I think. I don't know if that answers your question in the way that you had put it, but that's at least where my mind initially goes when I start to think about that dynamic.
No, you absolutely did. Yeah, absolutely. Something else though, too. I was really hoping to find a reference to Paradise Lost in here, and you did not disappoint. I got very excited when I saw this kind of section come in, because I kept kind of, as I was reading beginning, I was waiting for it, and it showed up here. So let me go ahead and quote you, and then I'll bring you in here, because I like the way that you set this up. You write that there are also those figures in myth and religion who are far from wordless when it comes to the perceived wrongs visited upon them. but are instead almost eloquent enough to convince the reader that they are in fact the true heroes of the tale. Now, for anyone who has read Paradise Lost, this is Milton's Satan, right? In a nutshell. Incredibly eloquent. You mentioned Killmonger from Black Panther, and we can talk about that, but I also wanted to ask you, have you seen Thor Love and Thunder yet? Have you seen it? Okay, so I'd like to bring that in as well a little bit, even though that it came out after your book, because when I was watching it with my wife, right after the opening scene with Gorr, she turned to me and she said, "Oh God, I want Gorr to win already. If this is the bad guy, I'm rooting for the bad guy." So between Killmonger and Gorr and through this idea, this lens of Milton Satan even as well, let me ask you this. What purpose do these complex characters or villains, if you want to use that term, what do they serve in mythology and in the more modern mythology of the MCU? Why would an author want us to feel sympathy for these figures?
Yeah, that's another great question. And my perspective would be that it's the fact that all of those things, all of those impulses, all of those experiences are also part of our own experience. It's all inside of us, that we all have the same motivations and we all have the same reactions. If horrible injustice is visited upon you, as the case with Killmonger, as is the case with Gorr, then I think that it's perfectly reasonable, it's perfectly human to react and feel in the ways that they do. And so it really does blur the lines between a hero and a villain, a hero and a monster, because there are times where the monster maybe potentially can be right. It doesn't mean necessarily within the story that the monster is going to win, but because there are times where maybe sometimes a feeling that is right for us, a cause that is right for us, is one that also could be potentially destructive. Um, One more contemporary story you can add in is Frankenstein, the original Frankenstein novel, where the creature, oftentimes considered as a monster, is he really a monster? Is the monster actually the inventor, in this case, the Dr. Frankenstein himself? Where one has a great deal of sympathy for the creature, just as one has a great deal of sympathy for Gorr and for Killmonger. And that is maybe not necessarily the impulse, it's not necessarily the feeling, is the actions that follow up on that. Is Gorr then justified in everything he does? Is Killmonger then justified in everything he does? I think that, at least within the context of the films, you arrive at a place where the answer is no, and that's why the other characters intervene in the ways that they do. And so the purpose, though, of that story, the purpose of those kinds of characters, is to help to trouble our own consciences and help to let us out of a very simplistic way of thinking about morality, and a very simplistic way of thinking about right and wrong, a very simplistic way of thinking about the categories of hero and monster. Because all along, there are ways in which we can see dualities in each of the characters, and then the dualities between the different villains and monsters that they fight. So it's another way in which, when you go into human experience, our experience of the world is not where right and wrong is always so plainly placed in front of us. We have to navigate our way through. And so when there are complexities within these characters and complexities within these narratives, it helps to mirror our own personal experience.
Yeah, and it also made me think of something that I hadn't really explored beyond, before kind of reading your book really well. At least I've talked to some students about it, but I find Thanos to be a much more complex kind of villain than we give him credit for. And specifically, the transition that the MCU made between Infinity War Thanos and Endgame Thanos is really quite a magnificent thing to behold, right? Because the Infinity War Thanos is kind of playing that role of the benevolent dictator who's trying to bring you a kind of salvation. And we've seen that before, right? Hitler comes in saying, I'm going to bring Germany back up. We're going to make this rise back to the top. I'm bringing salvation. And then there's this transition moment where if you reject that benevolent dictator's love, they become a petulant child of destruction. And that transition that takes place in Thanos between the benevolent dictator who just wants to take away half the world, but it's for our own good, and then the rejection that takes place in that last fight scene when you have Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America together, and Thanos is sitting there and tells them, kind of, you rejected my love. And now I see that all that's left is to completely destroy your world. I really wish people could just think about that, because I've read articles about, I don't know about you, but about Infinity War Thanos, or Thanos in general, that either call him an eco-terrorist or an eco-hero. I mean, it's quite interesting that I think it's the type of figure that we should give a little bit more thought to.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there are a lot of layers there. I think there are a lot of ways in which he is a fascinating character for those reasons. And I know that within my own courses, students are fascinated with him. And students who had the opportunity to, and the course that I teach, we use a theme of heroes and monsters. And so when they do a research paper towards the end of the course, some of them do select, a number over the years have selected Thanos as someone to research for those reasons. They don't go quite so far as saying that they thought that he was right, but this notion of, well, he saw a problem and he came up with a solution. And so and this is usually a qualifier, from a certain point of view, then you could see him as the hero of his own story, and all of the obstacles were the villains that he faced along the way. It's not so much that he didn't diagnose the problem as then what he proposed to do about the action that he went forward with. And I think that your comparison to between the two representations of Thanos is a really interesting one, because you can see that change occur, and you can see the way in which there's kind of a curtain or a veil that drops. You can see the real impetus behind that. This is someone who cares only about himself and only about power. But that is kind of the revelatory moment there in Endgame, that you can then use to kind of reinterpret. When you rewatch Infinity War, it does watch a little bit differently, having seen those parts of the following film.
Yeah, and I appreciate the fact that they don't leave that that Infinity War Thanos where he is, that they move him toward that kind of more defined stance of, okay, no, this is actually wrong. It is wrong. And I actually appreciate, because I've always thought that, I'll give you an example of what I mean. So I can recall sitting in the movie theater watching Captain America Civil War, and thinking to myself, okay, so what does this actually break down to when we talk about Captain America versus Iron Man? What are they representing? And I always found that I thought Iron Man was representing a kind of postmodern skepticism of the hero's ability to differentiate between right and wrong, good and evil. And therefore, on the benevolent reading of Stark's interpretation is that, why would you concentrate such an important decision on, say, one or just a few people, when instead you can spread that decision out to a larger body, a governmental body? And so there's a certain way that you can see Stark's point there. And I thought, when I was sitting in the movie theater, I thought that Marvel was going to just end on that note and say, yes, it makes sense to do that. But instead, they actually went the route of Captain America. And at least my reading of it is, ultimately we sided with Captain America's version, which is, wait a second, you have to have a belief that we can differentiate as a people instances or clear instances of right and wrong, good versus evil. And I give them a lot of credit, because it was kind of a gutsy move to make, to really sort of, I think, put the audience in the position of having to say, actually, I trust the heroes. I trust them. We can trust, people to differentiate, and therefore sort of saying to the audience, that's within you. Now, this is not to say that we're always right. But it was a gutsy call to make, to try to say there is something within you that should have confidence at times in being able to differentiate right from wrong, good from evil. Am I wrong in that, or does that make sense?
No, I think it does make a lot of sense. I think it does. I think that is ultimately where the story arrives, where and I think it's in that way trying to be affirming of each individual person in the audience being able to connect at that level. Um, One way that I've also interpreted that conflict in that particular film is outside of some of the geopolitical implications, as this confrontation between two people who actually are very hurt, where one of the other motivations for Stark is that, as we learned at the beginning of that film, he and his girlfriend have also broken up. And so he's also feeling lonely. And so this is a way of holding his surrogate family together. And on the other hand, Captain America has, through his previous films, gone from a very optimistic and I'll go along with whatever the government says to then in his second film seeing that the organization he's worked with has been infiltrated by his very own enemies, has been corrupted from within. So he's lost his trust and his faith. So he's not about to buy into something like that again and be hurt again. So it's kind of this battle of two very hurting individuals, at least individual. And so then you can use that as a microcosm for these bigger, also fascinating questions to get in. And that's one of the things that I've also enjoyed about the movies is the ways in which you have these individual people and the characters embody these larger questions. So you can talk about them as individuals and what they're going through and how those individual problems are the stand-ins for the bigger issues between, say, freedom and security, going back to the original comic that Civil War was based on. But it makes it much more individual, and you can feel it in maybe a more intimate fashion because of knowing the backstories of these two people that have been having this confrontation. But I think it does arrive at the kind of conclusion that you're suggesting throughout the remainder of the films, that we do, through that period of the phase 2 of that part of the MCU, start to question some of the actions of these heroes, start to question some of the impacts, the ramifications that they have. But ultimately, there's a way in which they find faith in themselves. And so that encourages people to try to find faith in themselves as an audience. It's really an uplifting sort of way of thinking about it. It's the most recent Spider-Man film, I think, goes through those same sorts of quandaries where he has to make a number of moral choices and he loses confidence in himself, but regains it at the ends and has to make an even more heartbreaking decision, but makes it with the confidence that he's doing the right thing. So I think that throughout you have that period of the origin story is usually fairly happy. Then you have the complication. Then you have the refinding of one's direction, one's purpose. And so that also is a formula, but it's one that I think works really well. It's worked throughout the stories. I think that the first 3 phases of the MCU are kind of that formula writ large in a way.
Yeah, I agree. In your book, you bring up an old friend of mine that I haven't visited in a long time, and that's Julia Kristeva, and her concept of the abject. So let me bring Kristeva into this a little bit to set the stage for the question. She writes, "It is not lack of cleanliness or health that causes abjection, but what disturbs identity, system, and order, and what does not respect borders, positions, and rules. It is the in-between, the ambiguous, and the composite." Now, I remember it's been quite a while since I've read Kristeva and used her in my own work. But I have to admit, I had never really made the connection between the abject and the superhero world, or the MCU in particular. Can you take us through how Kristeva's reading of abjectness helps us better understand the MCU and its characters? Because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, there are really 2 ways that I use that concept. One is to talk about the different villains that we find within the MCU and the ways in which they are, and part of the way I encountered Kristeva was through what's known as a subfield, which is monster theory, the study of monsters and the ways in which monsters have been theorized and embodied and considered throughout world mythologies. And Kristeva's in that particular quote, that particular concept of abjectness is something that is used because monsters throughout cultures tend to be represented in that way. That's those things that lurk in the in between, that frustrate categories, and therefore are seen as problematic. But even though we can apply that to a lot of the villains and monsters within the films that the Avengers and the other heroes face, you can also apply it to the heroes themselves. And that's another reason why, going back to one of our previous questions, that I thought the concept of the religious virtuoso was helpful, because those figures can be similarly ambiguous, since they occupy that space in between the regular community and the power with their mediating between. And so, just as the heroes can be salvific in some sense, where they're saving people from dilemmas, they also create their own problems. To go to the second Avengers movie, Ultron's existence is entirely their own problem that they then have to solve themselves, and they create all of this damage. The Incredible Hulk is a figure who goes on a rampage. I think it's entirely their own creation. So even though this is a concept you can apply to monsters and to the villains, it's also the one that you can use to think about the liminal space that these heroes occupy, and has really been something that they're occupying ever since the moment that they became heroes, since the moment that they became these powerful entities. And so this is where I think I'm trying to blend a little bit more of a critical eye to the role these figures play. Yes, there are ways in which you can look to the stories as affirming, but also these are problematic characters who are, to use one of the quotes we have about, I think from one of the makers of one of the films, these are damaged individuals. These are people who they've been damaged by being able to wield the power that they have. And so you can also, at the same time you admire them, have a little bit of pity for them too, because their lives will not be the same, because they exist forever in this spot in between, not quite human, but not quite something else. They are this mix and mash of different categories.
One of my favorite sections of your book, because there's not a lot of work that's done or written particularly about movies like Iron Man 3 or Thor, especially Thor, The Dark World. So one of my favorite sections of your book is when you talk about purity, impurity. And particularly you kind of even set up for this question a little bit with your previous answer. You talk about how Iron Man 3, The Dark World, and Captain America, Winter Soldier kind of work as a triad of films that set the stage for chaos and confusion when we get to Avengers Age of Ultron. How do the themes of purity/impurity function within these three films? And how do they lead us to confusion, chaos, and ultimately Ultron?
Yeah, it does actually flow really well from those concepts that we were just talking about, where by the time you get to that part of the larger narrative, that second phase, you see the kind of the shine has worn off a little bit from the earlier movies, which were clearer triumphs over the different villains and monsters that they faced. And some of the problems are more internalized. So you have people who are, in each of those cases, closest to the heroes are drawn more into the conflicts. For Thor, it's where the ether has infected his girlfriend, Jane. And so this then leads to a problematic confrontation within Asgard. With Captain America, it's the infiltration of Hydra into S.H.I.E.L.D. And for Iron Man, it's a literal contagion that's both leads to his girlfriend being infected, but also to his friend Happy Hogan being injured. And so the problems seem to come home a lot closer. And so one way that I read it within the book is the ways in which power, sacred power, within a lot of mythological traditions is seen as contagious, that it's not always localized within the person who is the mediating factor, that's being in close proximity to those individuals can lead to problems to to people who are around them. So that's why the sacred is normally seen as separate, as being closed off, and at most as possible kept at bay because of the problematic issues. It's useful, but it also leads to these complications. And so what I was arguing is we see the same thing within those films, is that now that these heroes have been touched by power, that power doesn't stay in one place. It bleeds over and it leads to all of these problems that undercut the very sort of order and the very causes in a lot of ways that the heroes are trying to fight for. And so I found that to be, an interesting complication of the usual narrative, where the the obstacle or the monster is easily defeated. It seems to then build up to questions about whether or not the heroes are even something that one wants to have around in society. That's the essential question that kind of tends to boil down to within a second Avengers movie with Age of Ultron, where Captain America asks the question, Ultron sees us as monsters. And so the way we handle this is going to determine whether he's right or not. So I thought was a really interesting way to frame it. It does kind of cap off that second phase and tie up some of those themes throughout the films that led up to it.
Yeah, I'm one of the few people, at least who admits it publicly, that I actually liked the second Thor film. I liked Dark World, believe it or not, better than the third one, better than Ragnarok, to be honest with you. I'm not sure. I was told that I'm just absolutely crazy for that, but I just thought that there was a depth. Yeah, I thought that there was a depth there in that film, that maybe the issue was you had to do a little more work to enjoy it. Like, you had to actually be active, I think, in watching that film to really kind of get what was going on underneath it. And of course, Winter Soldiers is phenomenal. I did not like Iron Man 3 though. I don't know if that makes, because I thought that the premise was good. The idea that he would have to at some point address that Stark would have to address kind of the PTSD of everything that he's been going through, how that would have just brought anyone down to their knees. But I thought that the way they approached it was not in a very genuine way. That didn't actually, I think, speak to the seriousness of kind of what he was going through. But I thought that was more of a problem with execution than writing.
Yeah, and if with dozens of films, there's not always going to be the same the same outcome. We're not always going to like all of them the same. And so, if you ask my personal opinion, I've always liked the three Captain America films as a trilogy better than some of the other ones. I was also kind of lukewarm on Ragnarok. The Dark World took me back to some of the older Thor comics that I liked as a kid, and so there's kind of a nostalgia that I had for the movie as a result. One of the things you sometimes find is right now within the Marvel fan community is a scene developing between those who really, really like the humor element, and those who are saying, yeah, but we want more serious content now. We've had enough of the humor. And that's something that's coming out more with the Thor films, with Ragnarok and Love and Thunder. So it'll be interesting to see how going forward that's handled and that's dealt with. But yeah, I felt the same way about the Iron Man films. The second and third one, I tend to rank lower than some of the others for the reasons that not because the concepts are bad. The concepts are really good, but there just seemed to be something lacking. Didn't quite get over the top for whatever reason.
Yeah, I'll just simply go on record as saying I'm not a fan of the movement toward this level of comedy, and particularly, I thought you had something in Thor that you could not get from any other character. That character with the godlike storyline and background is not so easily replaceable. You can make a lot of the characters that we come across in the MCU into kind of comedians. Ant-Man is even a comedian as well, and in Guardians of the Galaxy, basically the entire cast does comedy, to a degree. But when they shifted Thor and Hemsworth to a kind of almost like a stand-up comedian role in a movie, my question just simply would have been, well, how are you going to replace that amazing history that's behind that? I mean, Kenneth Branagh, his directing in that first Thor movie was absolutely phenomenal. I would have loved to have seen him do more. I really would have with what he did. I loved the first Thor movie, and to me, it just seemed like you lost something that you can't easily replace. Um, but that's just me. Uh, Something that you mentioned earlier, but I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into it if we can, because it changes the way that I think about um, Gilgamesh and loss and mortality. Because when I've taught Gilgamesh before, we talk about mortality, but I'd never thought of connecting these two between the MCU and Gilgamesh. We know that facing our own mortality is a major theme in the great works of mythology, but this idea of bringing in the loss that's in Infinity War, and then that loss that also carries over into the beginning stages of Endgame as well. I thought that was a phenomenal connection that you made between Gilgamesh and the MCU here. Can you talk a little bit more about that connection of facing mortality, maybe specifically in Gilgamesh or mythology as a whole, and then how it also connects into our reading of the sort of back end of phase 3 of the MCU?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, and thank you for the compliment. I'm glad that that connection worked. So it's within Gilgamesh, the the thing that's always struck me about that story is the way in which this character his grief is expressed, and the way in which there is, no filter on how bereft he is at the death of his friend, and his realization for the first time this is a fate that waits for him as well. And within my classes, sometimes we compare it to with the stories of Siddhartha Gautama and his seeing of the four sights, and then this really gets him out of his slumber. He's like, I've got to do something. That there's this specter waiting for me too, and so that sort of motivation to go and confront one's mortality. So it's something you find in many different stories, and with Gilgamesh, it then prompts this journey to try to find some way to solve his impending death and to try to live forever, which of course he can't, and he fails pretty miserably at being able to do so. But the part that I like about the story, at least that, the version that we use in my classes is the Stephen Mitchell version. And so at the end of that, you come back and he's failed and he's defeated, and he looks at the city ramparts and the gates and then sees the stuff that he has built, and almost as if for the first time, because the story also starts with a description of Uruk, and he's describing the same things again. And you wonder, he's not really said explicitly, but at least the conclusion you can draw from that is that he's changed a little bit, that he now sees this in a way that he didn't before, and he has an appreciation for it, that maybe there are some things that will carry on. And the meta level is that we're still reading this story 4,000 years ago, this person who was afraid that he would die and be forgotten, and here he is, and we're still talking about him. So there is a kind of immortality. And this is something that came to mind with those two films, because you have death and loss right at the end of Infinity War in a brutal fashion, where again the heroes have failed. And the price is then half of the universe, and a lot of their friends and close loved ones are now gone. So then in Endgame, you have this opportunity for a journey to try to rectify this. They're able to, in a sense, they're able to bring back all those who are lost through this sort of mythic, time traveling, quantum realm version of what you see in a lot of other stories around the world, journeys to the underworld to try to bring back lost loved ones. They usually don't end well. But the thing that I found most interesting, at Endgame, of course, and I hope this is not a spoiler for anyone, because probably if you wanted to see, Endgame, you have by now. But they're not able to completely overcome death. In the person of Thanos, whose name literally can be interpreted as death, that they have to sacrifice someone, and that ends up being Tony Stark, who then gives his life then to cement their victory. And so, yes, death can be conquered, but only to a point. And so it's both a thing we can transcend, but also not transcend. There's a paradox there that I found very human. It's like, Gilgamesh realizes I can't beat death, but maybe I can, at least in the works that I leave behind. And that's the same thing we kind of arrive at with Tony Stark. He can't beat death, but he can do so by what he leaves behind, and that's the legacy of the Avengers and legacy of this this victory they've had. So I found it to be this very paradoxical but beautiful way of looking at a story that has been told many times, and that in the theater where I saw Endgame the first time, there was this palpable reaction from the audience where this really seemed to land with them, and so that was one of the reasons why I thought I need to write something about this, because this seems to really be touching people. So that is one of my favorite parts to think about within the whole three phases that I write about in the book.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I'll never really think of Gilgamesh again without thinking of this fantastic connection, because I love them. I love them both. All the epic stories that just always speak to me. And like you in the movie theater of Endgame, I was prompted to write about it and research about it too, because as I'm sitting in the theater, as soon as Captain America picked up Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, my theater went crazy, absolutely crazy, and people are crying. And my audience will know this story, so I won't go into it too much. But when I asked my students what they thought of the film in the spring of 2019, I had multiple students tell me I was crying hysterically. And I thought, wow, there's something here. This is speaking to us on a level that's beyond. It's making the most of narrative. It's using, somehow speaking to us on a level, on a mythological level, something that transcends time and cultural specific moments in history, and speaks to the core of what it means to be human. And I just find that to be so fascinating in how Marvel was able to do that in those first three phases. I'd like to ask you something now. I just have two questions left. That's it. And they deal with family a little bit, and connecting. We can connect this to the book and the stories as well. But I wanted your opinion, because you've done such a wonderful job researching, mythology, and researching also the MCU. And you can tell me if I'm wrong. I'm finding a lot of the stories in phases 4 to be not as much suitable for children, for young adults. I find them moving a little bit, I think, more toward an older audience. And that's concerning for me, because because narrative is such an important tool for young people as well as older people to teach about what it means to be human, to find courage in difficult times. And I just kind of wanted your opinion. Is this something that you see as well, or not?
That's an interesting question, and it's not something necessarily that I put a whole lot of thought to in terms of audience and who the new narratives might be speaking to or not. What I have found is that it seems as though we're going in a lot of different directions with the different stories, and there seem to be a lot of different genres that they're playing out. And so some of that is entering into different media as well, with the streaming episodes of television shows in addition to some of the films. But that's something I would probably need to think a little bit more about. Maybe go back and rewatch and rethink about some of those different stories that have come out. But it's an interesting observation that I have to put maybe a little more thought to.
Sure. So I want to end our conversation by kind of going back to the beginning. And that, what I mean by that, is the beginning of your book, essentially. In the acknowledgement section of your book, you thank your wife, Jeanette, and your two sons, Xander and Luca, for going on this journey with you and rewatching the films, and even offering notes and ideas. I think in academia, sometimes it's easy for us to forget who we're doing this work for. I think all academic work, to a degree, should be geared toward a better understanding of what it means to be human. So my question to you is, what did you learn from your family while rewatching these films that you might not have picked up on if you went through this heroic quest alone?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for bringing up that part, because this was something that I really enjoyed doing with my family, and they of course were there with me when we saw Endgame. Had the same reactions, and how emotionally uplifting, but also draining the experience was, because you felt like you really went through something by the end of the film, and so watching it together was really really impactful, because we each have our own personalities. And so they were able to really give insights into how each of the characters might have been, the things that they might have been going through, and helping me to read those levels of things and motivations and so forth. And so having different eyes on those texts, and the call of the film's text, which I think we can, was really helpful to be able to, and also just to enjoy it, because one of the things that can happen when you're working on any project is that you can start to lose some of the motivation and maybe some of the initial enthusiasm. And so watching the films together and seeing their reactions, I was never short of enthusiasm, because of the excitement of the content and the encouragement that I got from them. So it's definitely something that was made so much better by being able to share it with them, in ways that maybe I wouldn't be able to share it on other projects.
That's fantastic. Well, Michael, when I saw the title of your book, I knew I had to get it, and it did not disappoint at all. I encourage people to pick up a copy and get some much needed mythology and motivation in their lives, I think. And then probably even rewatching those first three phases of the MCU, waiting for the fourth one to kind of conclude as well, and just enjoying them with family, and encouraging families to talk about it, even to enjoy it together the way that you do, in that acknowledgement. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge with us. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation, and it was a great a chance to talk about these things. So thank you again.
Heroes in mythology are important for strengthening our resolve. Life throws some pretty terrible events our way, and monsters that attempt to remove our sense of worth and try to convince us that we are not worthy of loving others or of being loved. And as much as I love philosophy, there are times when philosophically engaging something only deepens the abyss from which our terrors have emerged. In times like these, it is sometimes best to turn to story, particularly heroic myths. When we read about the struggles of the great Gilgamesh, we learn that fear is a part of existence. When we read of the rage of Achilles dragging the body of noble Prince Hector around after defeating him in battle, we learn the value of mercy. And when we find ourselves sympathizing a bit too much with Milton's Satan's corruption of Adam and Eve, we remember that forked tongues are not only found in snakes. Remember to subscribe/follow, leave a kind comment or rating where applicable, and share the episode with a friend. Until next time, try to keep one foot firmly planted on neutral ground. And have a great day.